Cesar Chavez is one of the most well-known and well-respected labor leaders in American history. Inspired by the nonviolent resistance of figures such as Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., as well as by his Roman Catholic faith, he was the leader of La Causa, Spanish for the cause, a movement of farm workers to organize, negotiate, and bargain for better working conditions. Despite his history of accomplishments, as well as a commemorative holiday in his honor, his legacy is not one without its glaring flaws, and while it's important to remember the positive impact he had on workers in his time, it is equally important to recognize his blind spots, as his line of thinking regarding one prominent issue is one that pervades, to this day, a large segment of the body politics mindset. With that in mind, it begs the question, what is Cesar Chavez's legacy? Cesar Chavez was born on March 31, 1927, in Yuma, Arizona, and moved to California during the Great Depression of the 1930s after his family's homestead was foreclosed on. After a car crash left his father, Librado Chavez, critically wounded, the young Chavez ultimately dropped out of high school and joined his parents, who were migrant farm workers working full-time in the fields. After a brief tenure in the U.S. Navy during World War II, Chavez returned to California and became a member of the National Agriculture Workers Union in 1947. After marrying Helen Fabela the following year, he moved from his hometown of Delano to San Jose, where he became a lumberyard worker. While in San Jose, he met the Catholic priest Father Donald McDonnell, who introduced Chavez to the Community Service Organization, or CSO. Over the next decade, he established multiple local CSO chapters throughout California, led voter registration and pro-social and economic justice campaigns on the organization's behalf, and worked his way up to becoming national director for the CSO. However, he ended up growing frustrated with the CSO's refusal to support his efforts to help farm workers unionize, so he resigned from the organization in 1962, moved back to Delano with his family, and founded the National Farm Workers Association, or NFWA. His decision to relocate back to Delano to found the NFWA was due not only to the fact that his relatives there would be able to support his efforts, but also in large part because of the amount of farm workers in the area who he felt he could recruit to join his new union, as workers in the agriculture industry had long been ignored. Minimum wage laws did not apply to them, nor could they rely on unemployment insurance if they ever were laid off from their job through no fault of their own. As a result, he saw them joining this union as their chance to finally be seen and heard. Chavez's most notable campaign was the 5-year Delano grape strike, which began on September 8, 1965, when 2,000 members of the Filipino-American Union, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, AWOC, walked out on the job to protest for wage increases as they were paid less than minimum wage at the time. AWOC President Larry Itiong urged Chavez and the NFWA to join the strike, to which he agreed. That December, Chavez launched a boycott against grapes produced by Schenley Industries, one of the largest corporations of the grape industry of Delano. By 1966, all grape producers were included in the boycott, and the AWOC merged with the NFWA to form the United Farm Workers, or UFW, an affiliate of the AFL-CIO. That year, Chavez led the striking workers on a 21-day, several hundred-mile march from Delano to Sacramento, directly confronted the powers that be within California, who had either denied that there was even a strike, or downplayed the seriousness of the conditions that the striking workers were protesting against. A firm believer in nonviolence as a means of protest, by 1968, he began to fear potential union violence, and subsequently began a now well-known hunger strike to express this concern. After 25 days, his fast ended, and he remarked, quote, "I am convinced that the truest act of courage, the strongest act of manliness, is to sacrifice ourselves for others in a totally non-violent struggle for justice. To be a man is to suffer for others. God help us be men." In 1970, after 5 years, the strike and boycott ended in a win for the grape workers, who reached a collective bargaining agreement with the growers, increasing wages and affirming their right to a union. After another 5 years, then California Governor Jerry Brown signed into law the California Agricultural Labor Relations Act of 1975, making California the first state in America to give farm workers the right to unionize. The Delano grape strike, the resulting boycott of table grape growers, and the victory for farm workers' unions that followed would ultimately come to define the legacy of Cesar Chavez. However, there is one aspect of Chavez's legacy that cannot be ignored: his attitude towards illegal immigration. To put it mildly, his positions on the issue of immigration would not be accepted by most on the left today. In fact, in the late 1950s, while working for the CSO, he was the leader in the fight against the Braceros program, which granted undocumented Mexican immigrants a legal work permit. He complained that corporations were using these Braceros in order to replace their current labor with cheaper labor. However, he wasn't just concerned with preventing their exploitation in the workplace, as he also actively sought to prevent them from entering the country in the first place. In one instance, he urged union members to stand along the Mexican border to block immigrants from entering. This narrative, that undocumented immigrants are responsible for the hardships suffered by the working class, is one that is prominent even to this day and a cornerstone of right-wing populism. This narrative, however, has been debunked, or at the very least discredited, multiple times, including in a 2018 study published in the American Economic Review, in which the researchers state, quote, "An important class of active labor market policy has received little impact evaluation. Immigration barriers intended to raise wages and employment by shrinking labor supply. Theories of endogenous technical advance raise the possibility of limited or even perverse impact. We study a natural policy experiment, the exclusion of almost 500,000 Mexican Bracero farm workers from the United States to improve farm labor market conditions. With novel archival data, we measure state-level exposure to exclusion and model the labor market effect in the absence of technical change. We reject such an effect and fail to reject a null effect." While Chavez may not have been the architect of this narrative, his perpetuation and advocacy for it, combined with his positive reputation among the working class, almost certainly further legitimized it. However, in later years, he seemingly began to evolve his position on immigration and express support for amnesty and, by 1974, was referring to undocumented immigrants as the UFW's brothers and sisters. Despite this, he still seemed to defend his previous views on the issue, stating that, although he sympathized with the exploitation of them, he did not express his sympathies without the caveat that, quote, "If there were no illegal aliens being used to break our strikes, we could win these strikes overnight and then be in a position to improve the living and working conditions of all farm workers." Regardless of whether or not his change in attitude was genuine, it does not erase the fact that he had perpetuated that harmful narrative in the first place and had acted on these beliefs. While it's important to understand that people can change and that we should encourage them to do so, the legacy of the blame for workers' plights being placed on these immigrants makes it irresponsible to discuss Chavez's legacy without bringing up this aspect of it. Cesar Chavez was, and still is, a prominent historical figure. His contributions to the working class cannot be denied nor taken away from him, and we should celebrate and learn about these accomplishments, especially as we see a new labor movement beginning to take hold today. However, we must also acknowledge his flaws, particularly on the issue of immigration, and the impact that the narrative he supported continues to have on political discourse to this day. In spite of this, his overall impact on the U.S. has been positive, given how he has inspired countless working Americans to exercise their right to a union and to negotiate for better conditions. And that is the legacy of Cesar Chavez.